In the desolate town of Ashford, a chilling legend whispered through the narrow streets, one about vampires who fed not on blood, but on the final breath of their victims. These creatures of the night, once thought to be an ancient myth, had returned, drawn to the town's eerie silence and despair. Drive, Marlowe, a scholar of the occult, had come to Ashford to investigate the strange disappearances that had plagued the town for months. Each victim was found frozen in their final moments, their eyes wide with terror, lips parted as if gasping for air. No puncture marks, no blood drained, just the haunting emptiness of their last breath stolen. One evening, Marlowe found himself deep within the ruins of the old cathedral, where the air grew thick with an unnatural stillness. As he ventured further, he noticed faint whispers swirling around him, like voices carried on a dying wind. The temperature dropped, his breath visible in the frigid air. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, tall, gaunt, and draped in tattered black robes. Its face was pale and hollow, with sunken eyes that gleamed like dying embers. The creature inhaled deeply, as if savoring the remnants of the breath that lingered in the air. Marlowe stood frozen, unable to move, as the vampire's thin lips curled into a sinister smile. "You've come to understand us, haven't you?" The creature hissed, its voice a raspy whisper. "We do not hunger for blood. We feast on the essence of life itself, the very breath that keeps you alive. And when we take it, we leave nothing behind but emptiness." Marlowe tried to speak, but the air around him seemed to thin, as though the vampire was already drawing the breath from his lungs. His vision blurred, and he stumbled backward, desperate to escape. The vampire's bony fingers reached out, and with each step it took, the atmosphere grew heavier, suffocating him. "I've watched you," the vampire continued. "You're curious, brave. But bravery means nothing when you're gasping for your final breath." As Marlowe's strength faded, he spotted a glimmer of light near the cathedral's altar. With what little energy he had left, he staggered toward it, the vampire's presence looming behind him. His chest tightened, the air slipping from his grasp, but he pressed on, collapsing just as his hand touched the light. The creature halted, hissing in fury as the light grew brighter, pushing back the darkness that enveloped the cathedral. Marlowe could barely keep his eyes open, but he sensed the vampire's retreat, its whispers fading into the shadows. He lay there, gasping for air, realizing that he had narrowly escaped, but the threat was far from over. The vampires had taken too many lives in Ashford, and they would not stop until they had stolen every last breath. As Marlowe pulled himself to his feet, a horrifying thought crossed his mind. The light had saved him, but what if the vampires had already begun to evolve, learning to feed on more than just the dying moments? What if they had found a way to drain the breath from the living, bit by bit, until nothing remained? The air in Ashford was still heavy, and Marlowe knew that the true horror had only just begun. The vampires would return, and when they did, there would be no escape from the darkness that suffocated the very life from its victims. The night was far from over. As Dr. Marlowe stood in the cathedral, his breath still ragged. He felt the weight of what had just happened settle in. The air around him remained unnaturally still, but he sensed that the vampire was still close, perhaps watching from the shadows. The glimmer of light that had saved him began to fade, casting the cathedral in deepening darkness once more. Marlowe's mind raced, trying to understand what had repelled the creature. The light had seemed like a shield, but he hadn't seen anything that could explain its source. There were no holy relics, no candles, just the oppressive emptiness of the ancient ruin. What had driven the vampire away? Was it something he had triggered, or was it merely toying with him, allowing him to believe he had won? His thoughts were interrupted by a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, not from the vampire, but from the very walls of the cathedral. The voice was neither human nor beastly, but it carried with it a strange familiarity. It beckoned him, drawing him toward the crumbling altar. Marlowe, against his better judgment, followed the whisper. As he neared the altar, he noticed something he had missed before, an inscription carved into the stone floor. It was written in a language he did not recognize, but as he traced the symbols with his fingers, fragments of meaning began to emerge in his mind. The words seemed to speak directly to him, not as a text to be read, but as a dark incantation awakening in his very soul. Asterisk, the breath of life is a tether, and the tether can be severed. Asterisk, suddenly, everything made sense. The vampires of Ashford were not mere creatures of hunger, they were ancient beings who had mastered the very essence of life itself. By severing the breath, they cut the connection between the body and soul, leaving their victims as empty shells. But the inscription hinted at something deeper, a way to control this power, to manipulate it. Marlowe's breath quickened, and in the stillness, he heard it, the sound of his own breath. Each inhale and exhale echoed louder than before, as if the air was growing thicker again, closing in around him. His pulse raced. Was the vampire returning? Or was it something far worse? He spun around, expecting to see the gaunt figure lurking behind him, but instead, he was met with silence. The shadows remained still, but the oppressive feeling of being watched intensified. Then, from the darkness, a low voice murmured, "You've touched the tether, haven't you?" A figure stepped into the dim light, a man, or at least what seemed to be one. His skin was pale, but not lifeless like the vampire. His eyes glimmered with a predatory intelligence, and his lips curled into a knowing smile. Marlowe recognized him from the town's history books, an old portrait of Lord Cadwell, the last noble of Ashford, who had disappeared centuries ago. Lord Cadwell. Marlowe breathed, his voice trembling. Cadwell chuckled softly, his eyes gleaming with a dark amusement. "I see the legend has not faded entirely," he said, stepping closer. "But I am no lord, not anymore. I am something else." Marlowe backed away instinctively, but Cadwell raised a hand, gesturing for calm. "You've stumbled upon something ancient, something dangerous. The breath is more than life, Doctor. It is the key to eternity. But the vampires, they are just scavengers, parasites feeding on the last remnants of it." "What do you mean?" Marlowe asked, feeling the air grow heavy again. Cadwell smiled, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You think they hunt for breath out of hunger? No, they hunt because they fear. They fear the tether being severed for good, not just for their victims, but for themselves. You see, once the last breath is stolen, they too will die. And in this town, in this place, you found the tether that binds them to this world. But there's a catch." Marlowe felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What catch?" "The tether is not just theirs," Cadwell said, stepping closer. "It's yours too. You, like them, are bound by it now. That's why they'll come for you, again and again, until they've drained your last breath." Marlowe's heart pounded in his chest. "Then how do I break it?" Cadwell's smile faded, and for the first time, his expression darkened. "You don't. Not without consequences. Severing the tether doesn't just kill them, it destroys everything tied to it. The town, its people, even you." Marlowe stood paralyzed by the enormity of the revelation. The vampires weren't just feeding, they were fighting for their survival, and he was now caught in the middle of their ancient war. As Cadwell's words sank in, Marlowe realized that the choice before him was far more horrifying than he had imagined. He could flee, but the vampires would follow him, drawing closer with every breath he took. Or he could stay, try to sever the tether, and risk the annihilation of everything. Before he could speak, Cadwell turned, disappearing back into the shadows, his final words lingering in the cold air. "They'll come for you tonight, Marlowe. And when they do, remember, every breath you take brings them closer." The night outside deepened, and the first whisper of the wind carried with it the faint echo of approaching footsteps. The vampires were coming, and Marlowe knew he was running out of time. The hours passed slowly as Dr. Marlowe barricaded himself inside the cathedral, frantically scouring every corner for a way to break the tether without destroying himself or the town. His thoughts spiraled as Cadwell's ominous words echoed in his mind. Asterisk, every breath you take brings them closer. Asterisk, the vampires weren't just after him, they were stalking him, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Night had fully descended when the first signs of their arrival began. The temperature plummeted, and an oppressive weight settled in the air. A low, guttural whisper crawled through the stone walls, growing louder as if the building itself was gasping for breath. Marlowe's heart pounded in his chest. His hands shook as he gripped a rusted iron cross, hoping it would offer some protection, though deep down, he knew it was futile. He wasn't fighting mindless monsters. These vampires were far more insidious, far more intelligent. The silence was broken by a soft tapping at the cathedral door. Just a single tap, almost polite, like a visitor arriving for a midnight conversation. Marlowe held his breath. Tap. Another, louder this time, with a sharp crack that splintered the ancient wood. His grip tightened on the cross. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were out there, waiting, starving for the breath he still held within him. Suddenly, the door exploded inward with a deafening crash. A cloud of dust and debris filled the air, and through the haze, the gaunt figures began to emerge. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent hunger, their skin tight against their bones, as if they were already tasting the breath in his lungs. Marlowe staggered back, retreating toward the altar. The vampires moved slowly, deliberately, their footsteps soundless as they closed in. Their leader, the one who had first confronted him, smiled, revealing jagged, yellow teeth. "You can't run from us, Doctor," the creature rasped. "We've tasted your breath, and now it belongs to us." In a panic, Marlowe lifted the cross, brandishing it with trembling hands. The vampire laughed, its voice low and mocking. "Do you think that will stop us? We don't fear the holy. We fear nothing but the severing of the tether, and you are tied to it, just as we are." With a sudden movement, the vampire lunged forward, its hand like iron, gripping Marlowe's throat. He gasped, the air squeezed from his lungs as the creature leaned in close, its breath cold against his face. "Breathe, Marlowe," it whispered. "Let us have it." The others closed in, their mouths open, waiting to inhale the final gasp. Marlowe's vision blurred as the air was crushed from his chest. Desperation overtook him, and with the last ounce of his strength, he clawed at the altar, pulling himself up. His hand brushed the inscription on the stone floor, the tether. Marlowe's eyes widened as realization dawned. He could break the tether, he could stop them, but the cost would be everything. With the vampire's grip tightening around his neck, Marlowe made a decision. His fingers curled around the inscription, and he spoke the words he had deciphered earlier, his voice barely more than a breathless whisper. Asterisk, the tether shall be severed. Life and death no more. Asterisk, the effect was instantaneous. A shockwave ripped through the cathedral, sending the vampires flying back into the walls with a bone-shattering force. The air grew impossibly cold, and the entire building shook as if the very foundation of the world was being torn apart. Marlowe collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, but it was too late. The tether was broken. The vampires writhed on the ground, their bodies contorting in agony as their connection to the world unraveled. They opened their mouths in silent screams, their bodies collapsing into dust, their very existence erased. But Marlowe, he felt it too. His breath was no longer his own. It escaped him, spiraling up into the void as if his soul was being siphoned away. He clutched his chest, but there was no stopping it. He had severed the tether that bound them all, including himself. The town of Ashford trembled as the very life was drained from it. The streets, the buildings, the people, all of it began to wither, their breaths stolen in an instant. The entire town collapsed into nothingness, leaving behind only the hollow wind and silence where life once thrived. Marlowe fell to his knees, his breath gone, his heart slowing. The world around him blurred, fading into a suffocating darkness. The last thing he saw was the cathedral crumbling to dust, the remains of Ashford vanishing into oblivion. And in the final, gasping moment before his consciousness slipped away, he understood. The tether had not just bound the vampires to life, it had bound everything. Now, there was nothing left.